Are you in a chronically difficult relationship, maybe with a close family member or a romantic partner, and you're wondering what it's doing to your brain and your body? Well, stay tuned. I'm going to unpack it. Relationships are hard, but chronically difficult relationships, whether it's with a romantic partner or a sibling or a parent or an adult child, chronically difficult relationships can really take a toll on our brains and our bodies. Now, I'm going to break down the effects that those chronically difficult relationships have on our body. But before we do that, I just want to point you, if you are in a difficult relationship, or even what Leslie Vernick re refers to as the emotionally destructive relationship, I want to refer you to her book. It's a wonderful resource. In that book, she contrasts the emotionally destructive relationship from a difficult relationship. What I find in my own clinical experience and somewhat my personal life is that relationships can kind of ebb and flow from difficult into destructive and back into difficult. And difficult has a range to it anyway. Some things are mildly difficult, some things are severely difficult. Today I'm going to kind of lump them together. I'm going to talk about stressful, chronically difficult relationships with people with whom we are very close, not somebody at church that, when we see our anxiety goes up because we might have to have a conversation with them and we find them difficult to get along with. I'm not talking about that person. I'm talking about a person with whom you are close to or supposed to be close with. For example, your spouse. So, what tolls does the chronically difficult relationship take on your brain and body? Well, the first thing that happens when we are in a chronically difficult relationship is our body goes into what I've talked about before as threat physiology. That means our cortisol level increases. We might be at low or mid-level fight or flight. If the relationship's abusive, we might be at higher levels of fight or flight. And so we have this excess of cortisol in our bodies. And that does a number of damaging things. Remember, I've said this before, cortisol is great if you've got to run away from a bear, but as a baseline, it's really a harsh way to live because of the damage that what it does to the body. First of all, chronic cortisol like that increases blood pressure and it increases one's risk for cardiovascular disease as a result. But it also changes blood flow. The thought of running away from a bear, for example, that need or concept is associated with needing energy in our limbs. So blood flow is diverted away from our truncal organs like our heart and our gut and our kidneys and diverted to our arms and our legs so that we could run or so we could fight. It's that fight flight response, right? Well, that can damage those central organs over time, but it also alters blood flow to the brain. Some parts of the brain are going to get too much, but many parts of the brain are not going to get enough. And that can cause lots of long-term damage. One of the things that we see with those kind of chronically heightened levels of cortisol is increased inflammation. And we know that depression is a response to a neural cascade that is triggered by inflammation in the body. So, inflammation creates depression, especially when it's chronic. But the other thing that cortisol does is it suppresses what we call neurogenesis. Now, neurogenesis is the ability to grow new neurons. Now, once we reach adulthood, we can't just grow neurons in any part of the brain. There are certain parts of the brain, for example, the hippocampus associated with learning and memory, where we still can grow neurons. And it's important to be able to do that to keep our brains healthy and active and to protect us against mental illness as well as dementia as we age. But chronic cortisol reduces, it suppresses neurogenesis. So that's the first thing, cortisol. The second thing that happens when we're in that kind of chronic threat physiology from a chronically difficult relationship is what we call changes in brain morphology. That is the shape and size of certain brain structures. So this happens because of cortisol. But along with those changes in structural morphology, we have very concerningly changes in what we call the white matter. Now, we talk a lot about gray matter. You probably are familiar with what gray matter is. That's really what we see when we look at the cortex of a brain. But white matter is incredibly important. White matter forms what we call the myelin sheath along the axons of the neurons. And it's imperative for neural communication. The neurons cannot talk to each other. We don't have our brain connecting. The synapses aren't connecting and talking to each other if those axons aren't properly myelinated. That's the white matter that goes around the axon. Now, think of it this way. You have cords in your house, right? I have a cord right here plugged into my computer, and around the cord is a sheath. That sheath protects the cord, the wires inside of it, from shorting out or miscommunicating with another cord. Think about a bundle of cords now under your desk or behind your TV, and imagine that none of them had a sheath around them. They would short out. A signal coming in from the wall wouldn't go the right place. It might spark a fire. All kinds of bad things would happen. Well, that's what happens in the brain. What happens in response to stress is we have abnormal white matter, generally excesses of white matter and irregularities or deformities in that white matter. And as a result, the neurons cannot communicate effectively. And when the neurons can't communicate effectively, we start to see all kinds of side effects, communication side effects, concentration, learning, memory side effects, that sense of brain fog. We might have depression, we might have anxiety. All kinds of things happen as a result of those abnormalities in the white matter because of the disruption in neural communication. This especially happens in two parts of the brain: the hippocampus, which is where learning and memory kind of exist, and the amygdala. Remember, the amygdala is central for emotional regulation. If you have a disruption in the white matter associated with the amygdala, you will also have disruptions in amygdala function, meaning you'll have problems with emotional regulation. We also see, as a result of that long-term stress in these relationships, reduction in the size of the hippocampus. I was talking about a change in the morphology. We see less gray matter and a shrinkage in the hippocampus. Now, if the part of your brain associated with learning and memory shrinks, your ability for learning and memory, your capacity for learning and memory will also shrink. And then the final change in morphology that we see is related to the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. Typically, we see an increase in size in that in the amygdala, in not ways that help us with emotional regulation, but in ways that make us more emotional or more reactive or more prone to depression and anxiety. And we see a decrease in that prefrontal cortex. Remember, the prefrontal cortex is associated with altruism and empathy and higher order reasoning and thinking before you act. That part of your brain shrinks under that kind of chronic long-term stress that a person is faced with when they are in a difficult, chronically difficult relationship with someone like a spouse. Because of that, we get stuck in certain neural habits in our brain, for example, negative thinking. And it actually promotes what we call cognitive rigidity, which makes things like changing the way we think or changing our opinions on things much more difficult. We get kind of cognitively set in our ways. Now, this is going to bring me to the second to last important thing I want to talk about that happens to our brains and our bodies when we're in those chronically difficult relationships, and that is the reduction of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF. I've talked about this before in a couple of my videos. BDNF is the brain's fertilizer. It's what we call a neuromodulator. It's what regulates the production of all of the major neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are imperative for neural communication. Neurons cannot talk with each other without a neurotransmitter to make the connection. When we don't have enough BDNF, those neurotransmitters become under regulated and we might not produce enough of them. But more than that, this brain fertilizer is imperative, absolutely imperative for what we call neuroplasticity. That's the brain's ability to correct itself, to heal itself, to repair itself, to change its neural wiring and its neural habits. You have to have that brain-derived neurotrophic factor for neuroplasticity. If you have ever tried to get somebody to change when they're chronically stressed, you know it's very difficult to get them to make new mental habits. It's the stress. They don't have enough of that brain-derived neurotrophic factor to be able to enjoy the benefits of neuroplasticity. So stress modulation becomes really important, and that's very difficult to do when you're in a difficult relationship with somebody with whom you should be safe or close, like a spouse. The other thing that happens when we don't have enough of this BDNF, the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, is that it tends to impair our sleep. And that's, of course, also exacerbated by higher cortisol levels. So it becomes difficult to sleep. And when we're not sleeping, our brain is impaired. Studies show that sleep deprivation is functionally like trying to perform a task under the influence of alcohol, being a little drunk. You're not going to think straight. You're not going to be able to process correctly. Your eye-hand coordination is going to be off. Your visual spatial skills are going to be distorted. That's what happens with sleep deprivation, especially when it becomes chronic. And sleep deprivation is a risk factor, not just for mental illness, those kinds of diagnoses, depression, anxiety, triggering more severe illnesses like bipolar disorder, but it's also a risk factor for dementia. So we have to guard our sleep. The final thing I want to talk about related to what happens to the body when we are in those chronically difficult relationships is our telomeres. Now, perhaps this term is a little new to you, or maybe you're familiar with it. I'm going to break it down and try to make it as simple as possible. Imagine you have a shoelace. At the end of the shoelace is a plastic cap. We call that an aglet. The aglet, if it's removed, the shoelace begins to unravel. Well, at the end of our DNA, at the strand of DNA, there is a protective cap that functions like an aglet. It's called a telomere. Now, every time our DNA replicates, this is a normal process of aging, those telomeres get a little smaller each time, which is why as we age, we're more and more prone to diseases like cancer or other chronic diseases, heart disease, diabetes, etc. But for people who are under chronic stress, particularly in relationships, what we see is a dramatic reduction in the size and shape of those telomeres. Now, uh, you can recover that to some degree just through healthy living, healthy lifestyle choices, learning to manage your stress, maybe stepping back from that relationship and doing some deep evaluation with a good spiritual counselor. But what happens, and we've seen this in studies of women who have been in difficult marriages for long periods of time, is we see a tremendous or significant reduction in telomere length and structural integrity. That means though that DNA is starting to unravel or is vulnerable to the unraveling. What happens when that occurs? Well, we've increased our risk of cancer, we've increased our risk of dementia, we've increased our risk for almost all forms of disease, heart disease, diabetes, respiratory illness, etc. So, I've given you what might not feel like a particular set of good news. Why would I take the time to share this? Well, if you are in a difficult relationship, a chronically difficult relationship, I want you to know you're not crazy. You might feel like everything's falling apart. Your brain's falling apart, your body's falling apart. It's not in your head. It might be happening in your brain, but you're not making this up. These chronically difficult relationships take a toll on your brain and your body. And the longer you're in that relationship, the more severe or the higher the potential for the damage, I should say, there is for that chronic effect on the brain and the body. So what do you do? Well, my dear brother, my dear sister, if you find yourself in a chronically difficult relationship, know you're not alone. It's important to be able to talk about these things because I can guarantee you there are other people in your circle that are also in chronically difficult relationships, and you might not even know it. But the second thing I would tell you is this is bigger than you. This is bigger than you. So find a good counselor, someone steeped in the wisdom of the Word of God who can help you walk through this difficult season. That might mean ending the relationship, but it might mean finding ways to thrive physically, mentally, and spiritually in the chronically difficult relationship, despite it being difficult or destructive. I hope this has been helpful for you. Know that you're in my thoughts and my prayers. And until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you.